The slow thumping of his heartbeat resonated against his eardrums. It was in perfect unison with the sound of his boots crushing dried leaves on the ground. The nightly winterly air was cold, but the thick woolen scarf around his neck was enough to keep his body warm. Mark was taking one last walk, as he always did after dinner. One last walk in the wooded trail behind his house. He was only going to the big rock near the pond and back home. It was a 20-minute walk, back and forth. The noise of broken branches being stepped on filled the air, accompanied by the quiet breeze shaking the trees. It was a calm night. The stars littered the sky in all their shining glory, and in the distance, Mark could hear an owl hooting at the rising crescent. He buried his hands into his pocket to warm them up. To no avail. He regretted not taking his gloves with him. As he walked, he remembered the events of the day. From the kiss he gave to his cold wife before going to work, to the thank you he slipped her when he left the dinner table for his walk. He remembered hearing her talking about putting on gloves as the Weather Channel announced a rather cold evening, and how he laughed it up, saying it was only for 20 minutes, and she didn't need to worry. She said she didn't. The fresh air had assaulted him as soon as he was out of the door, but he hadn't let that deter him from going on his walk or going back inside to prove his wife right. When it came down to it, Mark was quite the stubborn man. His lips pulled together for a whistle, and the song Wind of Change by Scorpions floated about the atmosphere as he left his garden for the trail. Slender fingers fiddled in his pockets for some warmth as his thoughts vanished, leaving him with nothing else to focus on but the splendor of the rising moon through the branches. It wasn't that late, and yet she was shining so strongly it illuminated his path. It was like the little patches of snow were absorbing its light and reflecting it for the traveler. Mark changed his tune from Winds of Change to Jingle Bells, suddenly feeling quite festive. Halfway through the refrain, a loud bang had his heart stopping dead in his track. Mark's gaze scanned the trail, the wooded area, and the sky, but couldn't see anything. It couldn't have been his imagination, though. Even the owls stopped hooting their macabre tunes at the moon. It took him 5 more minutes to pull himself together, and once he realized there was nothing but the sound of the wind shaking what was left of the leaves in the tree, he started whistling and walking again. The song Jingle Bells had never been whistled so slowly. It never sounded as eerie as it did, coming out of his lips. Mark crossed the knotted trees, his indication that he was about 3/4 done with his walk to the pond. Fewer steps were taken toward his destination when he noticed a man in the distance, sitting by the big rock. He was feeding a fire and sitting on a log. Mark stopped whistling, and his brows furrowed, as he didn't think this trail was known to anyone but him and his neighbors. And from the shape of the man, he couldn't identify him. The pond also seemed oddly calm that night, despite the wind. Not a single wave rocked the surface, and in the darkness like that, it looked like a mirror. The reflection of the fire stretched over half the pond's surface, making it look even bigger than it actually was. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of Mark's stomach. He felt a knot tightening in his throat the closer he got to that man, and how he wished he had heard the owls hoot at the moon. He got his left hand out of his pocket and looked at his watch. He had been gone for 12 minutes, which meant that he would be late. It was okay though, since his wife said she wasn't worried. Mark decided to walk over and ask that man what he was doing there, as it was private property. It wasn't, but it didn't matter. He didn't really appreciate a stranger making a fire in the forest behind his house. The closer he got, the tighter the knot. Mark shivered and realized he was sweating when the atrocious feeling of a single bead rolling down his spine made itself known. He tried to shake his coat and have his shirt absorb it, but it continued its maddening descent to the small of his back. Swallowing heavily, Mark tried to focus on the fire and the man. He couldn't feel its warmth yet, and neither could he see the man's eyes, but he knew he was getting closer. His heart was beating a whole new rhythm, and the drums were only getting louder and louder. He finally reached the sand, and his boots couldn't find a grip, so he slowed his pace. Why can't I see his face yet? He was so close, and yet far enough that he couldn't distinguish the stranger's traits in the dark. Despite the fire, despite the glorious shine of the moon, it was like this man was surrounded by darkness. Mark blinked a few times, wondering if it wasn't his eyes that were playing tricks on him. The closer he got, the darker the man looked. He tried to look under the hood, but saw nothing but pitch blackness. "Hello?" No words coming out of the man. It was like he couldn't hear him, couldn't see him. Mark heard himself say hello again, but he felt so out of himself, his voice sounded disembodied. Still, nothing out of the dark stranger. Passing a hand on his forehead, Mark realized it was as dry as the sand beneath his feet. Then how come he felt like his whole body was covered in sweat? He could still feel the disgusting droplets sliding down his backside. "Are you a guest here? Were you invited by somebody?" Still, no answer. Mark felt frustrated, but he had never been a violent man to begin with. The other wasn't even moving. Maybe he was sleeping. It didn't look like a comfortable position to be sleeping in, but who was he to judge? Mark looked behind him and the darkening trail, then the sky, then his watch. 14 minutes had passed since he left his house. His brows knitted together. Only 2 minutes had passed since he first saw the man? He felt at least twice as much time had passed. A movement. Skeletal fingers rose and pointed to the log on the other side of the fire, inviting Mark to sit down too. His initial reaction was to wonder if this was a joke. Then it hit him. The guy had to be mute, and he was just telling him to warm up. It was true that his hands were cold, so very cold. Mark sat down and brought his hands closer to the fire. Minutes passed in silence, and he still couldn't feel his hands getting any warmer. He tried to blow on them, rub them together, put them over the fire, but nothing helped him get warmer. Meanwhile, he could still feel sweat dripping down the length of his back. It was almost dizzying, that contrast with the coldness of his hands and how hot and soaked his body was getting. He could only imagine what it would look like when he got back home and he wrung his clothes off the sweat. Maybe he was getting sick. Maybe he should be heading back home to his cold wife. As he was about to stand, the dark man rose his hand again, an index pointing up as if asking him to wait a minute. Mark looked back at his watch, and only a minute had passed since the last time he checked. It didn't make any sense. Something was off. It wasn't only the faceless shadow of a man in front of him. It was time itself that seemed to warp around this fire that didn't produce any heat. The fact that the pond was still a mirror despite him feeling the breeze on his cheeks only added to the strangeness of the scene, leaving Mark to wonder if he hadn't fallen asleep halfway to the rock. For all he knew, he was lying down on the ground by the knotted trees. Thump, thump, thump. His heartbeat picked up the pace and drowned out the noise of the wind shaking dead leaves. His throat felt parched, and for some inexplicable reason, he couldn't tear his gaze away from the shadowed man. It was like his whole attention had been stolen by that faceless creature. Looking at him more intently, he realized that he couldn't call it human anymore. What he had thought were bony fingers were actually skeleton digits. He could clearly see the space between each junction and the whiteness of the bones, now that the moon was finally shining upon them. He still couldn't see the man's face, but the reality was sinking in on him. He looked back at his watch. 16 minutes since he had left. But it felt like an eternity. Mark stood up quickly and tried to walk back toward the trail. A grave mistake. His steps led him right back in front of the hooded man and its cold fire. More and more sweat dripped down his back, so much that he felt even his front getting wet. He turned his gaze to the moon, to the forest, to the fire, and to himself, trying to ground himself into reality. It was like his clothes were filling with water, and he could feel his lungs trapped in a vice. "I'm only 35, Mark desperately pleaded with the mute darkness sitting by the rock, and it didn't reply. Neither was it rushing after him. Defeated, Mark made his way back to the log, but refused to sit. He felt too antsy for that. "Why are you here?" It wouldn't reply. Instead, it pointed one of its creepy, bony fingers at the pond. Mark closed the distance between him and the pond and looked down on the surface. It was like a mirror, and all he could see was his reflection. "Did I drown?" No answers. He looked back at his watch obsessively. 18 minutes had passed. 2 more minutes and surely his wife would start worrying. Right? Bending down, Mark picked a rock and threw it at the pond. It absorbed it without a single wave disturbing the surface, and even the water seemed as thick as oil when the rock hit it. He turned his attention back to the deathly being who overwhelmed him with its silence. Mark returned to sit on the log, confused. Why did it want him to look at the pond? Why was that fire not hot? Was he dead? Was he sleeping? Did he hit his head somewhere? The hooded darkness pointed back toward the trail. Rising from the log, Mark abandoned his host, thinking that maybe he could go back home. That this was a warning about not getting closer to the lake, or maybe that he needed to spend more time with his wife. It could be anything, but surely it meant that this evening walk was dangerous. Maybe he was one of the lucky guys who had an otherworldly experience that saved their lives. Except not. As soon as he entered the trail, the atmosphere itself seemed to change. It was heavy, and the sharp scent of metal assaulted him instantly. Mark started running toward his home, his eyes focused on the horizon, wanting nothing more than to see his garden appear in his field of sight. He crossed the knotted trees and tripped on one of their big roots. He slammed his head into the ground and closed his eyes. When he reopened them, he was facing his wife, but she wasn't looking at him. She was covered in sweat. He could see it on the shine of her forehead. When she went to wipe it, he realized she was wearing his gloves. There was something else in her other hand. Something he didn't even know his wife possessed. Debbie? Not a word came from her. He watched in horror as she dragged him to the big rock, where death was sitting by its cold fire, completely still. He saw her start a fire with his clothes, and he saw her throw a handgun in the lake. Bang. Mark looked one last time at his watch. 20 minutes had passed.